What if the reason your life has not changed is not because you are doing too little, but because you are still looking for proof in the wrong place? Most people spend years trying to force reality to move. They try to fix the relationship, increase the income, heal the anxiety, silence the fear, become more disciplined, more magnetic, more worthy. But what if reality was never responding to force in the first place? What if it has always been responding to something far more intimate, your inner state, your emotional baseline, the identity you return to when no one is watching? This is where everything begins to shift. Because if life is not merely happening to you, but reflecting you, then every desperate attempt to control the outside may actually be strengthening the very pattern you are trying to escape. The chase for love can reinforce loneliness. The obsession with success can deepen the feeling of not being enough. The need for immediate change can quietly confirm that, deep down, you still believe nothing is here yet. And that is the hidden trap. The external world is often slower than the inner world. It has momentum. It echoes old assumptions, which means there may come a moment when you feel different inside, yet nothing around you seems to agree. That moment is where most people turn back. But that moment is not failure. It is the threshold. And if you understand what that threshold really is, you may never relate to your reality the same way again. Have you ever noticed how the more you want something, the further away it seems to feel? It's subtle at first. You tell yourself you're motivated, focused, determined. You visualize, you plan, you take action. But underneath all of it, there's a quiet tension, a sense that something is missing, that something still needs to arrive before you can finally feel complete. And that invisible tension is not neutral. It carries a signal, because in the language of reality, what you feel consistently matters more than what you say occasionally. When you chase love, what is the emotion beneath that pursuit? Is it openness, or is it loneliness? When you push for success, is it inspired movement, or is it pressure, comparison, and the fear of falling behind? The system you are part of does not respond to your goals. It responds to your state. This is why seeking can become self-reinforcing. Not because desire is wrong, but because desperate desire is rooted in the identity of I don't have. And when that identity becomes dominant, reality mirrors it with precision. Not as punishment, but as reflection. So the real question is not, how do I get what I want? The real question becomes, from what state am I wanting this? Because if the state is contraction, urgency, or lack, then even progress can feel empty. But if the state begins to shift, if there is even a moment of internal completeness, of grounded presence without needing immediate proof, something very different starts to happen. The chase slows down, and for the first time, you begin to sense that what you were looking for may not have been missing, just unrecognized. If this is resonating with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this message reach more people who need it, and it tells me you're ready to go deeper into this work. What if the moment you stop reacting to your current reality is the moment it begins to lose its power over you? This is where the real shift begins, not in what you do, but in how you relate to what is already here. Because most people are not trapped by their circumstances, they are trapped by their emotional reaction to those circumstances. Think about it. When something in your life doesn't match what you want, what is your immediate response? Do you tighten? Do you resist? Do you mentally argue with it, replay it, try to fix it, or wish it were different? That internal contraction feels justified. It feels logical. But energetically, it binds you to the very thing you are trying to move away from. Resistance is not neutral. It is participation. And this is one of the most misunderstood principles of reality. Saying, "I don't want this," with intensity still keeps your attention locked onto it. The nervous system stays activated. The identity remains entangled. And the mirror continues reflecting the same pattern, not because you chose it consciously, but because you are still emotionally engaged with it. So, what happens when you stop? Not suppressing, not pretending, not bypassing, but simply observing without collapsing into it. This is neutrality. And neutrality is not indifference. It is power without entanglement. It is the ability to see clearly without being pulled into reaction. In that space, something unexpected happens. The pattern begins to weaken. Because what is no longer fed cannot sustain itself. And for the first time, you are no longer trying to escape your reality. You are stepping out of it. What if the version of you you're trying to become is already here, but feels unfamiliar to your nervous system? This is where many people get confused. They assume that if something is right for them, love, peace, abundance, it should feel natural, easy, immediately comfortable. But what if the opposite is true? What if the very things you say you want feel uncomfortable not because they are wrong, but because they are new? Your nervous system is not designed to prioritize happiness. It is designed to prioritize familiarity. So if you have spent years in patterns of overthinking, emotional guarding, self-doubt, or control, those states begin to feel normal. They become your baseline. And anything outside of that, even something healthier, can trigger subtle resistance. This is why people sabotage what they desire, not consciously, but through microreactions, pulling away when things feel too good, questioning opportunities that feel aligned, creating distance when intimacy deepens, or suddenly losing motivation when progress begins. These are not character flaws. They are protection mechanisms. Your system is trying to keep you within what it knows how to manage. So when you begin to shift internally, when you start choosing openness, calm, trust, or self-worth, there may be moments where it feels unfamiliar, slightly uncomfortable, even unsafe. And this is the moment that matters most. Because if you interpret that discomfort as a sign to go back, you reinforce the old identity. But if you can stay present inside that unfamiliar space, without collapsing, something begins to recalibrate. The nervous system learns. And slowly, what once felt foreign becomes your new normal. What if the delay you're experiencing is not a sign that nothing is happening, but evidence that something deeper has already changed? This is the part almost no one talks about. You begin to shift internally. Your thoughts soften. Your reactions change. You feel less triggered, more aware, more grounded. And for a moment, it feels like something real has moved inside you. But then you look at your life, and everything looks the same. The same patterns, the same circumstances, the same people showing up in the same ways. And this is where doubt enters. Did anything actually change? But this is where understanding momentum becomes essential. Your external reality is not a live broadcast of your current state. It is often a delayed reflection of your previous identity. Old emotional patterns, long-held beliefs, repeated behaviors, they create a kind of inertia. And even when you shift internally, that momentum doesn't stop instantly. It continues to echo for a while. This is the gap, the space between who you were and what reality has not yet caught up to. And most people fail here, not because they didn't change, but because they expected immediate confirmation. They look for proof too early. They measure transformation by visible results instead of internal stability. So they go back to reacting, back to doubting, back to reinforcing the old identity. But what if the real test is not whether your life changes instantly, but whether you can remain changed, even when it hasn't yet? Because if you can hold that state, calm, open, grounded, without needing immediate validation, something powerful begins to happen. The echo fades, and reality starts to reorganize around who you have become. What if the real reason people don't transform is not because change is difficult, but because they cannot tolerate the space where nothing seems to be happening? This space, the gap, is quiet, subtle, and often misunderstood. There is no dramatic feedback, no immediate reward, no external confirmation telling you that you're on the right path. And for a mind that has been conditioned to seek validation through results, that silence can feel deeply uncomfortable. So, what do most people do? They interpret silence as failure. They assume that if nothing has changed outside, then nothing meaningful has changed inside. And in that moment, they begin to question themselves. They revisit old thoughts. They react to old triggers. They slip back into familiar emotional patterns, not because those patterns are true, but because they feel certain. Certainty is addictive, even if it is painful. This is why the gap is so critical. It is not just a waiting period. It is a stabilization phase, a recalibration of identity, a moment where the new version of you is being tested, not by external pressure, but by the absence of reinforcement. Can you stay grounded without proof? Can you remain open without results? Can you hold a new internal state, even when the external world is still reflecting the old one? Because this is where identity becomes real. Not when everything aligns easily, but when nothing seems to confirm it, and you choose it anyway. And if you can remain steady here, without collapsing back into old reactions, something subtle begins to lock in. The new self stops being something you practice and starts becoming something you are. What if the only thing that keeps your old reality alive is your continued emotional participation in it? This is where awareness becomes transformative. Because most patterns in your life are not sustained by external conditions alone. They are sustained by how you repeatedly engage with those conditions. The same situation appears, and almost automatically, the same reaction follows. The same thought, the same emotion, the same internal narrative. And each time this loop completes, it reinforces the identity behind it. Not consciously, but consistently. So even if you say, I want something different, if your reactions remain the same, the signal you send does not change. And reality, being a mirror, reflects that consistency back to you. This is why observation is not passive, it is disruptive. The moment you can witness your thoughts without believing them, feel an emotion without acting from it, or experience a trigger without collapsing into your usual pattern, you interrupt the loop. You create a gap between stimulus and response. And inside that gap, something new becomes possible. You are no longer operating as the conditioned version of yourself. You are choosing. This is subtle work. It does not look impressive from the outside. No one may notice it immediately, but internally, it is a radical shift. Because every time you observe instead of react, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen a new pathway. And over time, those small interruptions accumulate. The reaction that once felt automatic becomes optional. The identity that once felt fixed becomes flexible. And the reality that once felt inevitable begins to loosen its grip. What if ignoring your reality does not mean denying it, but refusing to let it define you? This is where many people misunderstand the idea of not reacting. They think it means pretending everything is fine, suppressing emotions, or avoiding what is actually happening. But that is not power, that is disconnection. And disconnection always finds a way to surface again. True non-reactivity is different. It is the ability to see clearly without collapsing emotionally. You can acknowledge what is present in your life without turning it into your identity. You can recognize a lack without becoming someone who lacks. You can see conflict without becoming consumed by it. This is not denial, it is separation. And that separation changes everything. Because the moment you stop identifying with what you see, you stop reinforcing it internally. The nervous system begins to settle. The urgency dissolves. The need to fix everything immediately starts to loosen. And in that space, you are no longer acting from contraction. You are acting from clarity. This is why emotional neutrality is so powerful. It creates a clean signal, not mixed with fear, frustration, or desperation. Just presence, just awareness, just a quiet openness that does not need to force anything to change. And paradoxically, this is when change becomes possible. Because reality does not respond well to pressure, but it responds immediately to alignment. So the question is no longer, how do I escape this situation? It becomes, can I see this without becoming it? Because when you can hold that line, when you can remain internally untouched by what is externally visible, you begin to realize something unexpected. You were never inside the problem. You were entangled with it. What if the moment you stop needing your reality to change is the moment it finally can? This sounds paradoxical, almost counterintuitive, because everything you have been taught tells you that desire should drive action, that urgency creates results, that wanting something intensely brings it closer. But what if intensity, when rooted in lack, actually locks you into the very experience you are trying to escape? There is a difference between clear intention and emotional dependency. Clear intention is grounded. It moves forward without tension. It allows space. But emotional dependency says, I need this to happen so I can finally feel okay. And that subtle shift changes everything. Because now your emotional state is tied to an external outcome, and until that outcome arrives, you remain internally unstable. And reality mirrors that instability. This is why people can achieve what they once wanted and still feel empty. Because the state they practiced while pursuing it was not wholeness, it was lack, pressure, and anticipation. So, what happens when you release that dependency? Not the desire itself, but the need behind it. You begin to experience a quiet sufficiency, a sense that, even now, without everything being resolved, there is space to breathe, to be, to exist without tension. And from that place, your actions change. They become lighter, more precise, less reactive. You are no longer chasing. You are choosing. And that shift from needing to choosing creates a completely different relationship with reality. Because now, what comes into your life is no longer something you depend on to complete you, but something that reflects the completeness you have already allowed yourself to feel. What if the version of you that already has what you want thinks, feels, and moves in ways that would feel almost unnatural to you right now? This is where identity becomes the real center of transformation. Because most people try to change their life without changing the internal reference point they operate from. They attempt new actions while holding onto the same emotional patterns, the same self-concept, the same unconscious expectations. And when those actions don't immediately produce different results, they assume something isn't working. But the issue is not the action. It's the identity behind it. Every identity carries a baseline, how you interpret situations, how you respond under pressure, what you tolerate, what you expect, what you believe is possible for you. And this baseline silently filters your entire experience of reality. So even when opportunities appear, if they do not match your internal identity, you may hesitate, question, delay, or even reject them without realizing it. not because you don't want them, but because they don't feel like you. This is why real change can feel disorienting, because stepping into a new identity often means letting go of familiar emotional patterns that once defined you. It may mean responding calmly where you used to react, staying open where you used to close, trusting where you used to control. And at first, it may feel like you are acting, like you are pretending. But if you stay consistent, if you continue choosing the new response even when it feels unfamiliar, something begins to shift. The new identity stops feeling like a performance and starts becoming your natural way of being. What if your thoughts are not the problem, but your automatic belief in them is? This is one of the most subtle, yet powerful shifts you can make. Because most people don't realize that the majority of their thoughts are not consciously chosen. They are conditioned. They arise from past experiences, emotional memory, learned patterns, and protective mechanisms. And yet, the moment a thought appears, it is often treated as truth. I'm not ready. This won't work. I've seen this before. Something is going to go wrong. These thoughts feel real. They carry emotional weight. And because they are familiar, they feel reliable. But what if they are simply echoes, residues of an identity that is no longer aligned with who you are becoming? The problem is not that these thoughts appear. The problem is that they go unquestioned. The moment you identify with them, you reinforce them. You give them authority. And from that place, your emotions follow, your behavior adapts, and your reality begins to organize around that internal narrative. But what happens when you pause? When you observe the thought instead of immediately believing it, something extraordinary begins to unfold. You realize that there is a space between you and the thought, a quiet awareness that can witness without reacting. And inside that space, you are no longer controlled by the pattern. You are free to choose your response. This is where identity begins to loosen. Because if you are not your thoughts, then you are not bound to their conclusions. And the moment that realization stabilizes, a new level of freedom emerges. Not from controlling your mind, but from no longer being controlled by it. What if the behaviors you judge in yourself were never flaws, but intelligent strategies designed to protect you? This is where compassion becomes a form of power. Because many of the patterns you are trying to eliminate, overthinking, emotional withdrawal, people-pleasing, hyper-independence, avoidance, did not appear randomly. They were learned, conditioned, reinforced over time as ways to maintain safety, control, or stability in environments where something felt uncertain or overwhelming. At some point, these patterns worked. They helped you adapt. They helped you navigate situations where you didn't feel fully secure, seen, or supported. And because they reduced discomfort, your system kept them. It encoded them as useful. But what once protected you may now be limiting you. And here is where most people create resistance. They try to force themselves out of these patterns. They criticize themselves. They label these behaviors as weaknesses. And that internal judgment only strengthens the loop because it adds more tension, more pressure, more internal conflict. But what if instead of fighting the pattern, you understood it? What if you could see that behind every reaction, there is a part of you trying to keep you safe? This changes your relationship with yourself. Because when you bring awareness instead of judgment, the pattern no longer needs to defend itself. The nervous system begins to relax. The urgency fades. And from that place, change becomes possible, not through force, but through integration. You don't remove the pattern by rejecting it. You outgrow it by understanding it. And as that understanding deepens, something quiet begins to emerge. A version of you that no longer needs protection in the same way. because it finally feels safe to be real. What if real transformation does not feel empowering at first, but deeply uncomfortable? This is something very few people are prepared for. We often imagine growth as a clean, inspiring process. We expect clarity, confidence, momentum. But in reality, the moment you begin to act in alignment with a new identity, you may feel the exact opposite: uncertainty, tension, even fear.
Why?
Because you are stepping outside of what your system recognizes as safe. Every time you choose differently, speaking honestly instead of staying silent, setting a boundary instead of overgiving, staying present instead of escaping, you're breaking a familiar pattern. And that break creates friction. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something new. And new, to the nervous system, often feels like risk. So in those moments, your body may react. Your mind may generate doubt. Old thoughts may resurface, trying to pull you back into what is known. And if you are not aware of this process, you might interpret that discomfort as a signal to stop. But what if that discomfort is the signal to continue? What if it is not resistance to the wrong path, but resistance to leaving the old one? This is where courage becomes quiet. It is not loud confidence. It is not certainty. It is the willingness to stay present in discomfort without abandoning yourself. To hold your ground internally, even when everything familiar is asking you to retreat. Because each time you remain in that space, without collapsing, you send a new message to your system. This is safe too. And slowly, what once felt threatening becomes natural, becomes stable, becomes you. What if the life you want is not built through one big decision, but through the quiet repetition of small, almost invisible choices? This is where most people underestimate the process. They wait for a breakthrough moment, a surge of motivation, a clear sign that everything has shifted. But real transformation rarely announces itself like that. Instead, it unfolds through micro-decisions, subtle, consistent choices that, over time, reshape your identity. It happens in the moment you choose to pause instead of react. In the moment you speak honestly instead of pleasing. In the moment you stay present instead of escaping. In the moment you trust instead of controlling. Individually, these moments seem insignificant, but collectively, they are everything, because each small choice reinforces a direction, and over time, that direction becomes a pattern. That pattern becomes a baseline, and that baseline becomes who you are. This is how identity shifts, not through intensity, but through consistency. And here's the part most people miss. You don't need to get it perfect. You don't need to eliminate every old reaction or become a completely different person overnight. What matters is the overall trajectory, the gentle but persistent leaning toward a new way of being. Because even if you slip, even if you fall back into old patterns, each conscious moment still counts. It still interrupts the automatic loop. It still creates space. And that space compounds, until one day, without a dramatic event, you realize something has changed. You respond differently, you feel differently, and the life that once felt distant now feels aligned with who you have quietly become. What if your environment is silently shaping your identity, even when you believe you're in control? This is a layer many people overlook. You may be working on yourself, observing your thoughts, regulating your emotions, choosing new responses. But at the same time, you are constantly immersed in inputs, conversations, social media, news, cultural narratives, the emotional tone of the people around you. And all of this feeds your nervous system, not consciously, but continuously. Every image you consume, every opinion you absorb, Every repeated message about what is normal or expected begins to influence your baseline. It shapes what feels possible, what feels threatening, what feels familiar. So even if you are trying to move into a more grounded, open, aligned state, if your environment is saturated with fear, urgency, comparison, or negativity, your system has to work against that current. And that creates friction. This is not about isolation or avoidance. It is about awareness. Because the question is not just, what am I thinking, but also, what am I exposing myself to every day? Are you feeding your system calm or constant stimulation, clarity or confusion, expansion or contraction? Because your environment is not neutral. It either reinforces your old identity or supports your new one. And when you begin to consciously curate what you consume, what you listen to, who you engage with, what you allow into your mental and emotional space, you reduce the noise. And in that quieter space, something powerful happens. Your natural state becomes easier to access, not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped surrounding yourself with what was pulling you away from it. What if some of the strongest forces shaping your thoughts aren't even yours? This is where awareness expands beyond the personal. There are systems, subtle, invisible, yet powerful, that constantly compete for your attention. Narratives, trends, opinions, collective emotions. They move through media, conversations, institutions, and digital spaces. And without realizing it, you can become entangled in them. You start thinking about things you didn't choose to think about, feeling emotions that weren't originally yours, reacting to situations that don't directly involve your life. This is what happens when attention is captured, because attention is energy. And wherever your attention goes, your internal state begins to follow. These collective structures, what some frameworks describe as energetic fields of influence, gain strength through engagement. Not just agreement, but resistance, obsession, emotional reaction. The more you fight, argue, worry, or mentally replay them, the more they occupy your system. They don't need you to agree. They only need you to react. And once your nervous system is activated, your clarity diminishes. You become less present, less grounded, more reactive. And from that state, your choices begin to reflect that disturbance. So, what is the alternative? Not suppression, not ignorance, but conscious disengagement. The ability to see what is happening without feeding it with your energy. To remain aware without becoming involved. To choose where your attention rests instead of letting it be pulled. Because when you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your state. And when your state stabilizes, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop living in reaction to the world and start creating from within it. What if your emotional reactions are not random but predictable patterns your system has learned to repeat? This is where deeper awareness begins to reveal structure. Because what you feel in certain situations is often not about the present moment alone. It is a continuation of something older, an emotional imprint that has been reinforced over time. A tone your system recognizes, a response it has practiced. You may notice it in specific areas of your life. The same type of relationship dynamic repeating, the same anxiety appearing before opportunity, the same urge to withdraw, to control, to overthink, to doubt. And each time it happens, it feels immediate, real, justified. But what if it is also familiar? Your nervous system does not evaluate truth. It recognizes patterns. So when a current situation resembles something from your past, even subtly, it activates the same emotional response. Not because it is accurate, but because it is known. And known, to your system, feels safer than unknown. This is why change requires awareness at the emotional level. Because if you are not aware of the pattern, you will relive it. But the moment you begin to notice it, to feel the emotion without immediately acting from it, you create separation. You interrupt the automatic sequence. And inside that interruption, something new becomes possible. You can respond differently, not from the past, but from presence. This does not mean the pattern disappears instantly, but it begins to weaken. Because every time you feel the emotion without reinforcing the behavior, you are teaching your system something new. That is not who I am anymore. And over time, what once felt inevitable becomes optional. What if clarity is not something you need to find, but something that naturally emerges when you stop creating noise? Most people believe they need more answers, more strategies, more information, more certainty before they can move forward. But often, the real issue is not a lack of clarity, it is an excess of mental activity that drowns it out. Constant thinking, replaying scenarios, predicting outcomes, trying to control what hasn't happened yet. This mental overactivity feels productive, but in reality, it keeps your system in a low-level state of tension. And tension distorts perception. When your mind is crowded, everything feels more urgent, more complicated, more uncertain than it actually is. You begin to second-guess yourself. You hesitate. You look outside for validation. And in that state, even simple decisions can feel overwhelming. But what happens when the noise quiets? Not forced silence, not suppression, but a natural settling where you allow thoughts to pass without chasing them, without building on them, without needing to resolve everything immediately. Something shifts. Your attention returns to the present moment. Your body softens. Your perception becomes clearer. And from that space, insight arises, not as a loud answer, but as a quiet knowing, a sense of direction that does not need to be justified. This is alignment. It is not about having every step figured out. It is about being internally clear enough to take the next one without resistance. And when you begin to trust that clarity, when you move from presence instead of pressure, your actions become more precise, more fluid, more effective. Not because you forced them, but because they are no longer competing with noise. What if flow is not something you create, but something that appears when you stop resisting who you already are? This is where effort begins to transform. Because many people believe that progress requires constant force, pushing through resistance, overriding emotions, controlling outcomes. And while effort has its place, there is a deeper principle at play, one that is quieter, but far more sustainable. Flow does not come from pressure. It comes from alignment. When your actions match your internal state, when what you do is not in conflict with how you feel, something changes. Movement becomes smoother. Decisions feel lighter. There is less internal friction, less second-guessing, less need to prove or force. And yet, this does not mean doing nothing. It means acting from a different place. Not from urgency, but from clarity. Not from fear, but from presence. Not from lack, but from a sense of internal sufficiency. This is why two people can take the same action and experience completely different results. One is pushing, tense, trying to control the outcome. The other is engaged, grounded, responsive to the moment. The external behavior may look similar, but the internal state is not. And reality responds to that difference. Because when you are aligned, your perception sharpens. You notice opportunities you would have missed. You respond instead of react. You adjust without collapsing. And gradually your path begins to feel less like something you are forcing, and more like something you are moving with. This is flow. not the absence of effort, but the absence of internal resistance within it. What if the life you're waiting for is waiting for you to stop waiting? This is where everything converges. You've seen how reality mirrors your inner state, how chasing reinforces lack, how neutrality dissolves patterns, how the nervous system resists what is unfamiliar, how the gap tests your consistency, how identity shapes perception, how observation breaks loops, how small choices rewire who you are, how your environment influences your baseline, how attention determines your state, how clarity emerges from stillness, and how flow appears when resistance fades. But none of it matters if you remain in postponement, because postponement is subtle. It doesn't look like avoidance. It looks like preparation, like almost ready, like waiting for the right moment, the right feeling, the right sign. And while you wait, your life continues to reflect the version of you who is still not fully here, still not fully decided, still not fully embodied. So, what changes everything? Not a future event, a present decision. The moment you stop negotiating with your old identity, the moment you stop needing confirmation, the moment you choose, internally, quietly, without announcement, to be the version of yourself you've been conceptualizing.
Right now.
Not perfectly, not permanently, but sincerely, because that decision shifts your baseline immediately. Your reactions change, your perception adjusts, your energy stabilizes. And from that place, reality begins to reorganize, not because you forced it, but because you are no longer waiting for it to give you permission. You become the cause. And when that stabilizes, something undeniable happens. The life you thought was ahead of you begins to meet you where you stand. What if the only thing that truly delays your reality is your inconsistency in being who you've already decided to become? This is where the illusion of time begins to dissolve. Because it's easy to believe that change simply takes time, that you just need to wait long enough for things to shift. But what if time is not the primary factor? What if the real variable is stability? How consistently do you return to your new state? Because many people touch alignment but don't stay there. They feel clear for a moment, open, grounded,
certain.
And in that moment, everything feels different. But then something small happens, a trigger, a delay, an unexpected reaction from someone, and they collapse back into the old identity. Old thoughts return. Old emotions rise. Old patterns re-engage. And in that shift, the signal changes again. This is why reality can feel inconsistent. Not because it is unstable, but because the identity being reflected is not yet stable. So the question becomes deeper. Not, how do I change faster? But how often do I return to who I've chosen to be, especially when it's challenged? Because real transformation is not measured by your best moments. It is revealed in your most difficult ones. When nothing is going your way, do you still remain grounded? When there is no validation, do you still stay open? When the old pattern is strongest, do you still choose differently? This is where identity solidifies, not through perfection, but through return, again and again, until the new state is no longer something you access occasionally, but something you live from consistently. What if the external results you're waiting for are simply the final stage of a process that has already begun within you? This is where trust becomes essential. Because once you understand that reality reflects your internal state, you also begin to see that manifestation is not an event, it is a sequence. First, the shift happens within. Then it stabilizes. Then it reorganizes perception, behavior, and energy. And only after that does it become visible externally. But most people reverse this order. They wait to see something before they believe it is real. They look for evidence before they commit emotionally. They want confirmation before they allow themselves to feel safe, open, or aligned. And in doing so, they delay the very process they are trying to activate. Because the external world cannot lead the internal state. It can only follow it. So, what happens when you stop waiting for proof? When you allow yourself to feel grounded, even without results? To act with clarity, even without guarantees? To remain open, even when nothing around you seems to justify it? You begin to live ahead of your evidence. Not in illusion, but in alignment. And that alignment changes how you move. You become less reactive, less hesitant, less dependent on outcomes. Your actions become more coherent with your internal state. And over time, that coherence becomes visible. Not instantly, but inevitably. Because reality cannot help but reflect what is consistently embodied. And when you understand this deeply, something shifts inside you. You stop asking, "Is it working?" and start realizing, it has already begun. What if the path from where you are to where you want to be is not a straight line, but a subtle shift from contraction into openness? This is the underlying movement of everything you've been experiencing. At the beginning, there is contraction, a tightening in the body, a need to control, to predict, to protect. Thoughts become rigid. Emotions feel heavy. Your system is trying to keep you safe, but in doing so, it limits your range of experience. From contraction, protective patterns emerge. You overthink to avoid uncertainty. You withdraw to avoid rejection. You control to avoid loss. You people-please to avoid conflict. And while these patterns may reduce discomfort in the moment, they also reinforce the identity that something is not safe, not stable, not enough. But then, awareness enters. You begin to notice the pattern instead of becoming it. You feel the contraction without immediately acting from it. And in that awareness, a new possibility opens, a space between the trigger and the response. This is neutrality. Not passive, not disconnected, but present. And from neutrality, something begins to soften. You no longer need to protect in the same way. You start to allow, to open slightly, to respond with more flexibility, more clarity, more choice. This is the transition. From contraction to protection to neutrality to openness. And openness is where everything changes. Because openness is not weakness. It is availability. Availability for new experiences, new responses, new outcomes that could not enter when everything inside you is closed. And as that openness stabilizes, reality begins to meet you there. What if the peace, love, and fulfillment you've been searching for were never meant to be found, but remembered? This is the final layer most people overlook, because the journey often begins with seeking, trying to become better, to achieve more, to finally arrive at a place where everything feels right. But over time, something deeper begins to reveal itself. The more you release, the more you recognize. You let go of the urgency, and peace appears. You release control, and trust begins to surface. You soften resistance, and clarity emerges on its own, not as something new, but as something that was always beneath the noise. This is why the process can feel like returning rather than becoming. You are not adding something to yourself. You are removing what was never truly you. The tension, the fear, the constant mental activity, the protective identities, all of it begins to fall away. And what remains is simpler than you expected. A quiet sense of being okay. A grounded presence that doesn't need to prove anything. an openness that isn't dependent on outcomes. This is your natural state, not something to earn, not something to chase,
but something to allow.
And when you begin to live from that space, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first, you notice something subtle but profound. You stop relating to life as something you must fix and start experiencing it as something you can move with. And in that shift, fulfillment stops being a destination and becomes the way you exist. What if the moment you fully understand all of this is the moment you realize there was never anything to wait for? Because at the deepest level, nothing you've explored here is about becoming someone else. It's about recognizing what has been true all along. You were never separate from the reality you experience. You were always in relationship with it, through your state, your attention, your identity, your emotional patterns. The mirror was never broken. It was always reflecting, quietly, consistently, without judgment. And now you see it. You see how chasing created distance, how reacting sustained patterns, how waiting delayed embodiment, how inconsistency blurred the signal, how protection masked your openness. But more importantly, you see that none of this requires perfection, because transformation is not a performance. It is a return to presence, a return to awareness, a return to the ability to choose your state, even when it's challenged. And from that place, everything simplifies. You no longer need to control every outcome. You no longer need to force every step. You no longer need reality to validate you before you trust yourself. Because now, the direction is internal. And when the direction is internal, movement becomes inevitable. Not rushed,
Not forced.
but consistent. So the final question is not, when will my life change? It becomes, am I willing to live as the version of myself that no longer needs to ask that question? Because the moment the question dissolves, the answer is already in motion. If this shifted something in you, subscribe to the channel and join this journey of deeper awareness. Like the video and share it with someone who's ready to see reality differently. And remember, what you consistently embody will always find its way back to you.